Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kateshi Estate Extended Anaerobic Processed Zambia from Flux Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Flux, based out of Farmingdale, New York. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. This coffee was a suggestion to us by Howie, so a quick shout out to and thank you to Howie for the suggestion. Now, Howie had been pretty persistent on us doing a Flux review, so much so that he'd commented on nearly every single Coffee of the Month Instagram post we had, as well as our Coffee of the Month live streams. So he essentially told Howie to suggest a Flux coffee to us, and we will go ahead and review it. And to my surprise, this is the coffee that Howie suggested, so we went ahead and purchased it, and we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 49. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a significantly toned down one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 90 degrees Celsius, about 194 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which usually indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we also went a fair bit more coarse on the grind with this one as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, this is what I would typically associate with being on the more medium side of the spectrum, as this one definitely did have a notable bit of developed qualities to it and is notably more developed than the vast majority of even American-based coffee roasters that we do review on this channel. So for that reason, we will say that this one most closely aligns with a medium by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression. So that's actually the time frame in which we did receive this coffee, which was a little later than I probably would have started it, especially after opening out the bag and seeing the development of this coffee. But the first thing that I did notice was that it was slightly more robust and developed than expected, as it doesn't necessarily translate too heavy into the brew itself as of this try. However, it did have a very lively coating feel and a bright sense that was presented in a notably more tart fruit-like sense. In addition to that, there was a candied sweetness in the finish, so I found it to be an okay first impression. All things considered, especially given just how much roasty qualities there were in the aroma of the coffee itself, it didn't translate too heavy, and I felt that there was perhaps a little bit of optimism for this coffee going forward. Day 23 through the Chemex, and there was a pretty similar second impression, as it does have a very lingering feel to it in a much heavier sense. This time around though, we also got a slightly vegetal quality, as the coffee was lacking much clarity, this time offering a fair bit more of a robust and heavier quality that really seemed to dominate the overall experience. So I certainly felt some adjustments were going to be needed, as it felt like we were probably pushing this coffee a little too hard with our standard recipe. Day 26 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee has remained pretty similar to this point, as it's a bit too robust and slightly harsh, as it does have a very roasty quality to it, especially at this point. It's become the most pronounced that it had been as of this moment. Adjustments were certainly needed, as this coffee just felt very thick, so very full-bodied and textured, while at the same time being heavy in a lot of the qualities that it was presenting. Day 29 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15:1 at 93 degrees Celsius. The coffee was a little bit cleaner, but it's also extremely Catamore-like this time around, offering a strong woody and nutty quality at the forefront as well. Now, it's certainly worth noting that there are a lot of characteristics about this coffee that I was skeptical about going into it. First off, I'm not the biggest fan of Zambian coffees. One of the more obvious things, I'm not the biggest fan of anaerobic or heavier processed coffees. And then probably the biggest concern was the varietals that it did offer, as this one is part Catamore as well, and I've never found a Catamore coffee that I've liked in the slightest, so having this coffee also present in a Catamore-like sense was not necessarily ideal. Additionally, there was a very strong spiced component with a little bit of that caramelized sweetness in the finish, so there are positives, but for the most part, this coffee was skewing in the direction that I wasn't necessarily enjoying. Day 32 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was a little better, as it's a little bit cleaner with a lot of these strong Catamore qualities slightly toned down. Even then, they're still pretty well pronounced, especially at the forefront. Outside of that, there was a slight unusual herbaceous quality that did give this coffee a very strong green tint that can be in line with the listed kiwi. More of the candied sweetness in the finish again, but it's also accompanied by a pretty prominent roastiness as well. Day 35 through the V60 with even lower extraction adjustments. So that's when we went that down to 15:1, 90 Celsius, and an even more coarse grind. So initially from our standard grind setting, we went one notch more coarse, and then we actually went 2 notches more coarse after the first time going lower on the extraction, largely because I was trying to tone this coffee down even more. And it did help, The robust qualities are still there, plenty of the processing feel and more of the Catamore-like qualities. Once again, it was okay, but I think the overall heaviness was toned down in comparison. So as of this moment, best impression I had was the first time trying it, but from that point going forward, the coffee has been skewing pretty heavily in a lot of the less desirable qualities for myself. Day 38 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it definitely didn't help with this brew method as the coffee is super nutty and woody, especially in the cool down. Additionally, there's a slightly off funkiness to go with the tart and roasty qualities of this coffee, so I felt like we certainly needed to go back to the V60, as with that brew method I was finding at least some success. And on day 42 through the V60, and as of this moment, the coffee had lost all structure, leading to an intense combination of overly acidic booziness. So this time around, I was getting the brightness presenting in a slightly more uneven sense. In addition to that, there was a strong dark chocolate that encompassed a very uneven brightness and more of the Catamore-like spiced tones, strong wininess, and a heavy berry, acidic and boozy with a lack of definition. So even more qualities that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of to begin with. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. We'll start with the finish, level 5. So as I've said with so many reviews in the past, level 5 can be a negative thing if the coffee is lacking too much cleanliness, and as you can kind of see here in this tasting wheel, that's definitely the case with this one. It certainly was overbearing, especially given that the profile of this one was presenting in the qualities that I'm not the biggest fan of whatsoever. So I don't like the roasty qualities. I don't like the heavier berry qualities. I don't like the very uneven brightness. Pretty much anything that I was experiencing within this coffee, those Catamore woody spiced tones, none of it necessarily in line with my own preferences. So having that be there in a very long-lasting and intense sense was not necessarily ideal for me, but it did leave a very long-lasting feel to it. Acidity level 5, it wasn't always at the level 5. I feel like this coffee just seemed to skew even more in that direction the more we were working through it, as it seems to have aged out ever so slightly. And I think one of the things that went with that was the acidity, and that's one of the biggest sticking points for me when it comes to more processed coffees, especially from origins that aren't traditional in the sense like a Zambian coffee is. So for that reason, it did skew very heavy in that winey, boozy acidity that made this coffee feel even more uneven than it had already felt up to this point. I actually had one more level 5, and that is the berry fruit level 5. And I can't quite recall whether or not they had any sort of berry note list on here. I do remember kiwi was one of them, but for me, it definitely offered plenty of the heavier dark berry qualities that I often associate with natural processed Colombian coffees. The more I continued to work with this coffee, it felt like a less high point scoring natural processed Colombian coffee in the way that it had plenty of the heavier berry qualities to it and a very uneven brightness to it and a lot of boozy qualities as well. So it did score a level 5, not necessarily ideal for me. Really don't like those heavy berry qualities to this one. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 4s. We will start with the spice. Actually, we'll start with the sweetness level 4. That's the biggest saving grace of this coffee. I do believe it's roasted on a Probat, and I can see that based off some of the candied and caramelized sweet components that I was receiving from this coffee. But those were fleeting in the grand scheme of things, and in comparison to a lot of the other qualities within this coffee, including the spice, which is their level 4. I don't score too many coffees that high when it comes to spice. I think one of the ones I can think of off the top of my head is Milky Cake, which had a very spiced feel to it, but this one, on the other hand, it has that Catamore spice characteristic, and that's one of the big reasons why I try to avoid Catamore coffees. Between that and the woodiness, not necessarily ideal for me, and having it be as intense as it was, also not necessarily ideal. Citrus fruit, level 4. If I recall correctly, maybe one of the other notes they had listed on here was a citric note. A green grape, that makes a lot of sense. And they also have vibrant on here. So both of those actually make a lot of sense when I'm looking at it. So the green grape for the berry quality and then the vibrant for the very intense acidity to it. But the citrus fruit, yeah, the uneven brightness was also presenting in a very acidic citric sense as well to go along with the boozy qualities of this coffee. So that's why that scored as high as it did. I don't have great descriptors for a lot of these characteristics, largely because there isn't a lot of cleanliness or clarity or definition to them. So having that score there at the level 4, yeah, it's a pretty generic, bright citric quality to it. Chocolate level 4. And this one also had a very heavy dark chocolate quality, another quality that's pretty often associated with more processed Colombian coffees and even that more traditional developed coffees. So that's not too surprising that it did score as high as it did. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of that quality either. Smokiness level 4. Yeah, no matter what sort of adjustments we made, we really could not tone down the more developed roasty qualities of this coffee, and I feel like it just seemed to get worse the longer this coffee continued to sit. So for that reason, level 4 is where we opted to put that, and that's once again a representation of the profile of this coffee. Bitterness level 4, and bitterness comes in a number of directions, so that alcoholic like bitterness, the very heavy dark chocolate like bitterness to it as well. So a lot of bitter qualities that did score that in an unusually high level 4, which we don't have a lot of coffee score that high for bitterness. Also kind of that generic coffee bitterness to go with that too. Savoriness level 4, and that's interestingly the kind of very prominent woody quality of this coffee, which again, not necessarily my thing. There's also a very herbal, savory quality to this one, scoring it very high in that sense. And then body level 4, so that definitely is representative of a lot of the early impressions we had of this coffee that seemed to carry throughout. We mentioned that it felt very thick in a lot of ways, not just in terms of the body, but in terms of the overall intensity as this coffee just continues to come at you. So level 4, very heavy bodied in that sense. And we don't score too many coffees that high when it comes to body, as usually the coffees we brew tend to be a little lighter body than that. And then the final thing worth discussing, certainly the most important thing worth discussing, cleanliness level 1. There have been very few coffees that we've reviewed this year that have scored that level 1, and I usually reserve that for coffees that don't have great definition to the profile that it, or the flavor characteristics that are presented within it. If it has an uneven brightness, if it has a very boozy sense, and if it has a very long-lasting feel to it without that structure. This coffee happened to have all of them, coupled with a Catamount-like feel and a more roasty feel. So I would have had a very hard time justifying scoring this one any higher than that level 1. And given that cleanliness is the number one thing I prioritize with coffee, that's a little difficult for me to get through. But yes, level 1 is where we scored that. So yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me start with this. I certainly don't think that this coffee is a representation of Flux, as I don't think that even my favorite coffee roasters in the entire world could make me enjoy a coffee like this. This is legitimately, from top to bottom, everything that I would usually avoid when it comes to a cup of coffee. So the varietal, not my thing. The processing, not my thing. The origin, I've never had a Zambian coffee that I've particularly liked. Profile a little further along than I probably would have preferred, but I imagine they had to go in that direction given what this coffee is. So in theory, nothing that I really enjoyed from this coffee, with the exception of some slight and fleeting sweetness that I did get from time to time. But again, it's not really a representation of this coffee. This one is just, or this coffee roaster, this is just not necessarily a type of coffee that I would usually go for. Coupled with the fact that I really seemed to struggle to get this coffee at its best. I don't think my equipment is well suited for it. I mean, the purpose of the grinder that I do have is to amplify clarity. So if there's a coffee like this that is never going to offer that sort of clarity, it's always going to be difficult working with it. My water is certainly too soft for a coffee like this. So those two things did not help contribute to the overall results of this coffee. But at the end of the day, again, don't necessarily think it's a reflection of this coffee roaster whatsoever. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. We will start with the profile. It is definitely a little bit more on the developed side of things, and the biggest positive I had from this one was that it does have a very nice level of sweetness. I mean, it scored level 4 for that sweetness, and it has a nice caramelized aspect to it. And then I think the other quality is, if you don't mind Catamount-like characteristics, so that slightly spiced quality to it, if you don't like the more heavy processed qualities of a coffee, so the boozy sort of heavy berry quality, then this one does have great intensity for those that do enjoy that specific characteristic. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try the coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kateshi Estate Extended Anaerobic Process Zambia from Flux Coffee. Thank you for watching.